This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by OWC, Spectra 1964, Atom Audio, Samply, Isotope, and API. You're hearing my voice right now on the API 3122V mic pre and Spectra 1964 C610 comp limiter through Isotope, RX, Ozone, and Neutron, all recorded safely onto an OWC SSD and mixed on Atom Audio monitors. So get ready to rock.
Nobody gives a shit what stove you cooked it on and the pots you used. Just make the meal good. So if you can make a great mix on a pair of IK Multimedia iLoud speakers and a laptop and an Apollo, good for you. That's great. Do the work. Concentrate on making the clients happy. Don't get too caught up in the gear.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Atom Audio introduces the all-new A7V monitor with rotatable HPS waveguide for the accelerated ribbon tweeter and advanced onboard DSP-based room correction using the included A-Control software or optional SonarWorks software and measurement mic, allowing you to tune your speakers for your room, your mix position, and your ears anytime you want. Get the extended 5-year warranty for monitors that will improve as your studio improves at atomaudio.com. If you're ready to upgrade your studio to the famous sound of API's large format consoles, then you're ready for the box, a small format console featuring the same analog circuitry and original 2520 op-amp design that made API famous for more than 50 years. Record through 8 world-class mic pre-channels, mix through 24 smooth as glass faders, and upgrade your home studio to legendary status. API now offers a virtual console experience, allowing you to get a personalized online demo of the box at apiaudio.com. Howdy, Rockstars. It's Lid Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Matt Boudreau, a mix and mastering engineer for bands and solo artists. He's the producer and host of the fabulous podcast Working Class Audio, interviewing other audio professionals about their journey to where they are today. Matt also tests audio software for Universal Audio as a contractor and speaks on audio panels at conferences as the moderator and or panelist. In general, he loves anything audio related and also loves coffee and connecting with forward-thinking people in all the industries. I like to think that might be us rock stars. Matt has been involved in music and audio for 35 years, starting out as a drummer, working his way through bands and 6-figure record deals. He was lucky to experience firsthand how records were made in the studio on a high level with producers and engineers like Larry Hirsch, Joe Chicarelli, and Gil Norton. And these guys got Matt excited about the record-making process. In 1994, he started his journey to the other side of the glass, trading in his drumsticks for faders. The journey has taken him through a series of amazing recording experiences with many well-known artists, as well as many lesser-known artists. And now, Matt reaches studio fans all over the world through his podcast, Working Class Audio. He's also a published author and teaches mixing courses over at Working Class Audio. He's been on the podcast early on episode 53, and I am thrilled to have my brother from another podcast, Matt Boudreau, back to share some cool tips on mixing awesome sounding pro drums in your studio using plugins and sample triggers in your DAW, and also talk about what's new at his studio and new things going in like Atmos speakers. So very cool stuff. Please welcome back Matt Boudreau, my brother from another podcast, to Recording Studio Rockstars. Matt, are you ready to rock, dude?
I am ready to rock, my brother.
Welcome back, man. I can't believe it's been that long.
How long's it been?
Man, we're going back to like the very first year. I mean, this is like my 7th year doing the podcast. And I think it was like 7 years ago or 6 years ago that we did our first interview. It's crazy.
I think it doesn't feel that long because you've been on my show twice.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's long overdue for you to be on my show twice. So welcome.
Awesome. Glad to be back.
Of course, rock stars, in full transparency, Matt and I see each other all the time because we have our mastermind group that we call Blammo, where we get together and chat about all this stuff, podcasting, audio, surviving in the music biz and in the podcast biz. So it's good to see you, dude. Just saw you.
Good to see you. I know. I just saw you like
an hour ago.
Yeah, something like that.
Well, welcome back, dude. So on the last episode, of course, you covered your background in music and having a studio and launching a podcast and all that stuff. But it's been a few years. So I don't know if you want to kind of catch us up on what you feel like has been important to you in your journey over the past 5 years or so.
Yeah, I think, honestly, I think my podcast, Working Class Audio, has been instrumental in helping me improve my own life, business, well-being in general. I think talking to audio professionals once a week and finding out what works and what doesn't work has been helpful and very incredibly influential to me, so that, I hear what other people are doing, how they're doing it, and I cherry pick all their ideas. And, along the way, just getting more financially savvy, business savvy, audio savvy, of course, and just always trying to improve in every single way I can.
I think about that too. Just the process, the repetition of interviewing people, constantly staying immersed in a dialogue about the studio has helped me tremendously. It's hard to remember every single thing that every person you've ever talked to says, but it's very doable to have a whole lot of takeaways that really resonate with you, and you can hit the studio and try out the newest, latest thing you just learned.
Yeah, and also certain interviews I do have some. They're all. I enjoy all the interviews, but some people I interview have a pretty significant impact on me afterwards. The week after I interview somebody, I can't get the interview out of my brain. I think of all the great things they said and all the ideas I gleaned from the interview. It's fun to talk to people. It's obviously there's a social element to it, but the inspiration side of it is something I really treasure.
I know that, it's not all about the gear or anything, but how often have you found yourself shortly after having a conversation with somebody sneaking over to, Reverb or eBay or Amazon or whatever, and like picking up that thing that you just talked about, or like signing up for some software that you just learned about?
It's pretty rare, honestly, because we just don't go too deep down the rabbit hole with gear on my show. We certain things will get mentioned, certain ideas and concepts, and somebody might mention something offhand, a plugin, and of course, I'll go investigate and check it out. I'm not immune to the attraction of gear and the software that we use. I'm always looking for new ideas to improve my own game.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the things that I mentioned, of course, is that you've started teaching over at Working Class Audio. So you have an area of WCA called Tradecraft, which is a cool, clever title for the place where you go learn stuff. This is a trade that we do, right?
It is. Yeah, it is a trade. And admittedly, tradecraft is a term I think commonly used in the world of intelligence agencies. And I know that's a little, I don't know if that'll rub some people the wrong way, but I found it an interesting name. And I found that, like you say, it's a trade. This is tradecraft. And when you say starting to teach, yeah, I created my first course called Mixing with Drum Samples because it's something that I'm passionate about.
Yeah,
I don't find it a bad thing. Some people think of it as cheating, where I think of it as it's just another tool. And lots of people have done it over the years. People just don't really talk about it all that much.
Yeah.
So,
well, we'll get deep into that hopefully, because I've been through your course. and I was really struck by it. In my experience, I feel like it's easy to actually feel kind of like you kind of know things already. Oh, I already know about this, or I already know about that. But then when I went and watched it, especially some of the examples in there where you took the drums and you played, how did they sound when they arrived versus how they sounded in the end of the mix. And I was like, holy shit, man, that sounds great, dude. So very, very impressed.
Thanks. Yeah, it's not always the most appropriate tool to use in every genre of music or in any, some styles of music or some ways of, or I guess some tracks that you get have more nuances than drum samples can deal with. So sometimes I use it, sometimes I don't, but it's fun and it's a great way to really lift a track to a professional level when people don't have the budget to take the time in tracking to get great drum sounds.
Yeah, well, I've certainly struggled with that myself, where there's just been times where I thought we were getting great drum sounds, and then it come to the mix and it's just something's not coming together. But there's a great lesson that you get into, and again, we can get deeper into this stuff, but you talk about it's a like a, I don't know, was it a battle or something? It's a story of inches. It's like little incremental things and just additively improving and adding stuff. And so it's very cool. So
it's a game of inches.
A game of inches. Right. Okay, cool. So let me see here. We're talking about inspirations and stuff. And I know one of the things that you've done, I think since the last time we interviewed, is I believe you went off and got a chance to do Mix with the Masters with Chad Blake, right?
Yeah, I guess I did do that after we talked. Yeah, that was something that, I saw Mix with the Masters and I saw, okay, they're doing these seminars. And ironically, I was at a potluck audio conference and what was I doing? Oh, I got there early. Yeah, I got to the hotel early and Andrew Sheps and I are friends. And so I went to this ballroom where I knew that he was hanging out at. He was prepping for something. So I went in and we were chatting. And I said, hey, I saw that you did Mix with the Masters. How was that? And he was telling me all about it and how fun it was. And I said, boy, I'd love to do that. I not only would I love to do, your program, but I would love to do Chad Blake's. And he goes, oh, you don't, Andrew, a typical Andrew style. He's like, oh, you don't want to do my thing. He said, but yeah, Chad Blake, that would be the one I would go to. Mm-hmm. So when the opportunity arose, they announced Chad Blake. And I told my wife, I said, there's this thing that I want to do. It's kind of expensive and it would put me in the south of France for a week. And we discussed it. And she said, okay, well, I'll just, fly my parents in from Michigan to help with the kids. And which, of course, gave me an ego stroke because I thought, oh, it takes two people to take my job as a parent. But so, yeah, we worked it out and I happened to have the cash at the time and I plopped it down and got myself a cheap flight. It was in September, I believe. Yeah, that it was at that time of the year. So the pricing on airlines for airfare was super cheap. It was like $500 round trip from San Francisco to Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. And so I did it. And it was probably one of the most impactful weeks of my life. Simply, obviously meeting Chad, got a little starstruck, because I've admired him for a long time. And when he walked in the room, I was just like, oh my gosh, that's Chad Blake. This is the guy that I've been like admiring for so long. And since then, he and I have become friends and, that's a whole different story. But the experience with Chad was great, but the brotherhood, and I'll say brotherhood because there was no women there at this one. It was just all dudes. But it was great. It was fun to hang out with these guys from all around the world, not only from France, but from Israel and the Netherlands. And, there was a couple other Americans there, but we would have these meals, these group meals outside of this chateau that you stay at every night. And it was amazing. It's amazing to hang out. in the studio all day with Chad, and then all of us would group together. Before dinner, we would have a beer break. So they'd bring out this little beer machine, and you'd have some peanuts and some beer. So we stand around, and then they announce dinner is served, and dinner was always amazing. And there you are in the south of France, and the sun is setting, and there's candles, and you're sitting around this long table with
outside, right?
Outside.
Yeah, that's very southern. That's like very Pays Basque,
And it was an amazing scenario to be at, or involved in, just, the whole thing, every part of it.
That sounds like fun, man. And, with the warm weather and everything, that probably makes it really awesome. I've spent a little bit of time in the south of France, and I've experienced that big family dinner table scene and the slow, relaxed pace of having a meal. And it was a lot of fun. But of course, I didn't know anything about music or mixing when I went, because I was 13.
Yeah, and it's quite a vacation, because you're, of course, in the south of France, but you're also spending a week as an audio professional doing nothing but absorbing the workflow of another audio professional who you greatly respect. And not only that, but the guys that were there, oh my gosh, they were crazy talented. Some of the stuff they played, I was just intimidated by. I thought, wow, I have really got to up my game.
Did you have to bring stuff of your own to show off? And you're like, oh my God, what am I going to play?
Yeah. And it was interesting because, I went through a period of taking a break from Pro Tools and trying out Studio One for a little over a year. I was using it to edit the podcast. I was mixing in it.
That's right.
And when they announced it, they said, please bring material for Chad to play in Pro Tools. And that's when I was kind of souring on Studio One. It's not a bad software, but I was running into a very particular bug that I couldn't get solved, which was an undo bug where you couldn't undo what you had just worked on. And it was starting to become a colossal problem. And that's when I made the decision. I said, it's time to go back to Pro Tools.
Nice. Well, in your mixing drums with samples course, you're mixing in Pro Tools. And I was really struck by how fantastic you got everything to sound. So you got me excited to go back and do some mixing. I don't know how much you're allowed to talk about what you learned when you went to France and studied there under Chad, but maybe you can talk about some of the things that you found yourself doing new and different when you got back home, maybe around related to drums or maybe just around mixing in general. Were there things that have sort of transformed in your own workflow over the past few years?
Well, I will tell you what I experienced when I was there and the epiphany that I had. And so there was, Chad would be working at the console, and he's working essentially all in the box except for maybe one little Hughes surround type controller, or not controller, but device that he would use. And in fact, I think his has since broke, and I think he's found a replacement that he does in the box. But he would be sitting at the console, and on either side of him would be these giant screen televisions, and then all of us would sit on couches and chairs behind him, and he would be mixing, and you'd see what he's doing, how he's approaching things, what plugins he's pulling up. And there was at one point I specifically remember everybody in the room was watching him, and he pulled up a plugin, and then he pulled it down, and somebody was like, "Hey, Chad, can you bring that plugin back up? I want to write down those settings." And Chad turned around and he said something to the effect of, "Guys, it doesn't really matter. These are just settings for this mix, and they're not like a preset that is going to apply to everything. And you're going to come up with your own ideas." He really was encouraging us to understand that, we can be inspired by that, but we shouldn't be necessarily trying to write down all of his settings. And I took that to heart. I was taking general notes at that time, but that really struck a chord with me. And then probably about a day or two later, I realized, you know what you're doing. Speaking to myself, in my own head, I'm thinking, what you're doing. the thing to learn from this is to have confidence in what you're doing. So while I was incredibly inspired by what I was experiencing and in that environment, it really built the confidence in myself about what I had been doing. I've been doing this a long time, and I think, for better or for worse, I have never become famous like many of the people that I know, like Vance or Andrew or any of my friends in the world of audio and music. But I feel confident in what I do and how I do it. So that moment at Mix with the Masters just really built up my confidence in myself that much more. And I just began to realize, you know what? Sit back, relax, enjoy this environment, and absorb. Let this new information wash over you, and don't obsess about writing down plugin settings, because that's not going to change your mixing game. So that's the big takeaway from that.
Yeah, it's more like the experience of seeing and witnessing somebody's workflow. Maybe that becomes a takeaway that you might or be able to adopt, or those times when you hear how a small move can, help to transform a sound. I feel like that can help you think, oh, I see where I could do that. But it might be, you might use slightly different tools to do the same result or something, right?
Yeah. And, it's also the realization, and I mean, I knew this, but it just reinforced it, that, no matter what you do in this business, it's like, there's only one of you, and there's only one Chad Blake, and there will only ever be one Chad Blake. So to try to take the time to emulate him and copy everything he does, I think is not really a wise path. I think it's better to be inspired by, steal little ideas here and there. But other than that, I think it's best to chart your own path and learn what works best for you, and not necessarily, how can I be better at my craft by copying somebody else, like, plugin setting for plugin setting. I just don't think that is the smart way to do it.
Yeah. Well, that's cool, man. Ever wonder how I get a consistent sound quality mixing hundreds of episodes of Recording Studio Rockstars? It's because I've been cheating by using Isotope, RX, Ozone, and Neutron on every single episode. Right now, you are hearing RX breath control, declick, declip, DS, deplosive, voice denoise, Ozone multiband compression, Neutron EQ, and limiting, all from Isotope. Try out the subscription option for yourself with an extended 30-day free trial at isotope.com/rockstars, or use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off any individual plugin purchase. In my studio, I chose the OWC Mini-Stack STX Thunderbolt 4 certified storage and expansion hub because it seamlessly connects to my Mac Mini M1 for my dedicated audio drives, sample libraries, and backup drives. It's the perfect size to stack with the Mac Mini and add storage and connectivity over Thunderbolt or USB. Whether you have the new or older Mac Mini, nothing stacks up in your studio quite like OWC. Find the new Mini-Stack STX and all your storage needs at macsales.com/rockstars. What about the aspect of, I'm kind of pivoting towards the drum mixing stuff that I've seen you do so well. Do you what are ways that you as a drummer, how does that help inform you about how to get drums to sound fantastic in a mix? Have you thought about that? I mean, maybe somebody who doesn't play drums has a different kind of understanding or something.
Well, I think my method of working and the sounds that I strive for are directly impacted by the fact that I am a drummer. And as a drummer, our perspective is that of sitting behind the drum kit, where there's an impact that we feel as drummers when we hit the drums. And, the snare drum, you hit it and you whack it really hard, it comes right back in your face. And therefore, it's not like I'm trying to replicate what happens behind the drum kit in a mix, but I'm expecting the impact to still be there. I'm expecting the drive and the power and the foundation to be strong in whatever mix I do. So yeah, I guess that having that drumming background informs all of that. But also, growing up listening to music, I just naturally gravitated toward, the musical part of things. Sometimes growing up, my parents, I was a huge, Ozzy Osbourne fan as a kid, and my parents would always, they wouldn't prevent me from listening to Ozzy or any kind of music like that. But whenever I would say, they would ask me, what do you want for your birthday? I'm like, well, I want this new record by Ozzy Osbourne or this old record. And they're like, I went to go look at that record, and I'm not buying you a record that has a song called Flying High again. And I would just laugh. But my parents would also say, now, if your friends give it to you, that's a different story. I was like, oh, okay, well, so there's a little bit of leeway here. So growing up listening to records like that and just how the drums sounded really, really had an impact just on how I felt about music. Because, if you go back and listen to those records, the drums are, pretty upfront.
Yeah.
Now, whether they use samples back then, I don't know. I doubt it. Although, the use of the AMS, I can't remember if it's the DMX or the RMX. I get them confused. That was a common thing, for people to try to, use those to trigger back samples on some records. But the point I'm trying to make is that as a kid growing up and listening to rock music, I was really captivated by all the drums that I heard, which of course led me to being a drummer. So later in life, examining music more closely and learning, oh, okay, that sounds like that, not only because of the drummer, but they're reinforcing some of these things with drum samples in some capacity.
Yeah, and you begin to even recognize what kind of snare sound that is. Which snare, whether that was a wooden snare or a big metal snare. You begin to recognize things like, oh, they had an O-ring or they had a wallet on the snare for this sound, or this one's got nothing on the snare drum,
Right. And not to say that, you can't, obviously you can get great drum sounds without drum samples. You just have to take the time in the recording to do that and have a great drummer to do that, to complete that task. So early on when I was, getting my feet wet in the world of Pro Tools and learning how to mix in Pro Tools long ago, I think it was a disc that was, maybe it was a Bob Clearmountain disc that was floating around. There was a copy of it and somebody, gave me a couple samples and I was like, how is this going to work? What do you do with this? And then I discovered Sound Replacer and was like, oh, well, let me just drop this bass drum or this snare drum sample in there and see what that sounds like. And that's when it hit me. I was like, oh, this is how you get to that faster. And, Sound Replacer was a horrible program, in my opinion, as opposed to what we have now.
It was challenging for sure.
Well, you did it, and then you had to go back and double check all the work to make sure everything, all the phase was lined up, and it was a ridiculous thing, but it was a great start.
Yeah.
So when I got that going, that's when I noticed people were going, "Ooh, wow, the drums sound really good. What's going on there?" And I would just say, well, I dropped this little thing in here. Oh, okay. All right. Sounds great. Let's do more.
Yeah.
So,
well, it's funny because I've also explored all that and I've experienced messing around with samples and adding them to drums and stuff like that. And I've had some times where they've helped. More often than not, I found that the kick drum was helpful, but maybe not the snare I was trying to do. Because I feel like the snare is one of those places where maybe you're more sonically exposed, But I'm going to circle back, man. I'm going to keep pitching compliments at you. But honestly, in your drum mixing course, I was amazed at how just rock and roll you made a drum kit sound. I mean, you took stuff that sounded like a bad garage recording of a drum set with, which in some cases can be cool. Like, right, we come from an indie rock background. There are appropriate times for drums to just sound like some mics were up in a garage and that was the sound, and maybe we grow fond of it. But there are also times where that's the sound we get in the studio because that's just what we got. There are times where the drum set that we had was just the drum set we had. We didn't have an option to try out a few and then be like, whoa, that sounds amazing kind of thing, before a session. And there are times where somebody else recorded the drums and hands them over to you, and you're trying to mix it and you're like, squeezing the snot out of the drums, and you get them to start doing something, but you're like, you step back and you're like, these just sound like I squeezed the snot out of the drums instead of sounding like what I wish they would sound like. And, you did a remarkable job of putting it all together where when you play it in with the whole track and the band, particularly, let me see if I remember which one it was. Was it the Cordova or the Blind Pride example that was in the chorus?
Yeah. It's such a great song, and it really needs a rock and roll big drum sound.
Yeah, well, tell a little bit about the story of that band or the way they recorded, if I'm remembering which example it was, and how those tracks came to you. And so therefore you were like, oh, I think I need to step in and do these things to try and make this have the final mix result that it's asking for coming out of the speakers.
So my relationship with Cordova, and unfortunately they broke up. That's the number one thing. Number two, there were two Cordovas out there in the world. The one I'm talking about is the one from southern New Mexico. And one of the members in the band and I went to high school together, and we had stayed in touch over the years. So we hung out when I was back home I grew up in Las Cruces, New Mexico. So I went back to Las Cruces and was hanging out with my buddy Scott Guthrie. And so I can't remember how it came about, but Scott said, hey, I'm in this band Cordova. And I said, oh, I'd love to come down and hang out at rehearsal and check you guys out. And was just blown out of the water at how good they were. And I just said, hey, if you ever need somebody to work on some mixes, I would love to, put my name in the hat. And they gave me that opportunity, and they had put out some tracks before that song that's in the drum mixing course. And they gave me some tracks that were okay. The guitar and the bass and the vocals were well done, but the drums, that's always the hard thing for bands, I think. Unless in an ideal world, like if I was in a band and I was the drummer, I would say, let's go track with Steve Albini at Electrical, because Steve's got a great way of approaching it that is organic and he knows what he's doing. Not everybody has that opportunity, and not every engineer has that skill set. And maybe even if they have the skill set, they may not have the room to do it right, or the drummer for that matter.
I've done that, and it's a lot of fun to do.
I'm sure it is. I have great respect for Steve in that manner, in that studio. So these guys gave me their tracks, which their drummer was recording, and he is a fantastic drummer. And he had some recording skills. So he was doing it at his house. In fact, the first recording I did with him, they had done in another studio. And I took these recordings that were done by a mutual friend of ours and really kind of turned their brains upside down when I sent them the mixes, because they were like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Let's do more of this. So they did a series of songs, released it as a series of EPs. Now, in the case of Blind Pride, the song in the drum mixing course of mine, they sent me the tracks. And once again, guitars and everything else was well done. Drums were played very well, but the room they were in, you could hear it was done in a room with a low ceiling. It was kind of that bedroomy, garagey sound. And it just did not complement the music at all, because the guitars alone could crush the drums in their current state.
Yeah. It kind of had a boxy, dark quality to it or something, right?
It really did. That's a great way of explaining it. And so I did what I did. I have a particular vision in mind for what that band should sound like. And so I just applied my tools and did my thing and sent it to him. And then, once the band approved it, we sent it off to Kim Rosen in New Jersey to master at NAC Mastering, and it just came back phenomenal.
Nice. Yeah, well, that's what it sounded like to me. I mean, the difference is just night and day. So very cool stuff. Can we kind of dig into talking about mixing drums and, some basic questions around some tools we might use and things like that?
Absolutely. Fire away.
All right. Well, I feel like one of the things that comes up, especially for, the older rock stars like myself, we may sometimes find ourselves having a recording that was done back in the day on tape, and we're pulling it off the shelf and we're thinking, I'd like to work on this again. And the drums might have there might be a cool quality to them or something, but we may or may not realize that we can make it sound, we can add to that and enhance it in such a way that it could sound more like it was mixed more recently, not like it was throwback or not like we have to accept all these limitations. So if somebody has a recording that was originally done to tape, is it possible to add drum triggers still in a remix to something like that? Or does this have to be something that's brand new done in Pro Tools?
No, absolutely. You can do it. In fact, I do it in the mixing with drum samples course with an old band of mine with some tracks that were done in, I guess the late 80s, maybe the early 90s. And I went back to try to remix, and my drum sounds of my kit at the time were atrocious. It was this poorly tuned intro Tama drum set, which, it's neither here nor there now, but I could have tuned it better. And it could have been recorded better in a better room.
Tama lovers unite.
Right. Oh, I love Tama drums. I think they're fantastic. But this was like a little Tama Swing Star kit, and I didn't have a lot of money at the time. Some of my heads were probably beat up, and so that's an example of where I do that exact thing in the course. But even more recently, right now, I have a longtime client of mine, and he is doing the same thing. He's revisiting an old band he was in, actually in like 1985, 1986, I think. Matt Wallace did the recordings and the original mixes, and they felt like, well, those mixes aren't really up to today's standards. We want to remix it. We want Matt to remix it. Therefore, let's get the tracks digitized and send them to Matt and blah, 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 blah. Sorry, I don't mean to be talking in the third person.
From Matt to Matt.
From Matt to Matt, right. So I'm doing that very thing. And I think what people need to consider, though, when they're doing this and they're revisiting old stuff, there's a charm and a character to some old recordings. So before you start investigating using drum samples, I think it's wise to even try some mixes with the existing sounds just to see how far you get with that, and then ask yourself, well, what's lacking here? Do I need to add drum samples? Because if you start to do that, that will take the intention of that recording in a different direction. So yes, you can do it. But once again, I do think it's wise to, see what's there first before just throwing the baby out with the bathwater and replacing everything.
When you do begin to get into the world of adding samples to enhance a drum set, how should we think about this? Like, for example, if you got a kick drum and it's pretty good, but something about it just feels off to you, do we think about it like we get to keep the real kick drum and we're adding this other thing? Or are there times where it's better to mute the real kick drum and just swap it out with this other sample of a kick drum? Any thoughts about ways to approach it?
Well, I mean, you could do either. I mean, it all depends. I know that something that many people say. It all depends. If you ask Billy Decker, Billy just takes the kick drum out right from the get-go. I like to see what's in the kick drum and see if I can get it, part of the way there, and ask myself, what do I need? What am I missing? Can I get that from adding a sample, or do I just want to take it out entirely? Or, is there so many bleed issues or sonic issues like distortion or anything like that that's going to get in my way? And, it's just, I know I'm saying, you ask yourself these questions, but this is all happening rapidly in my head. I'm just like, no, that sounds good, or no, that doesn't sound so good. Let's replace, or no, let's just add a little augmentation to it to give it a little heft.
Right.
Maybe the top end of it sounds great, but the bottom end, it's like sometimes getting blood out of a stone. You're like, oh, they I don't know what they did or what mic they used, but I can't get any low end out of this.
The Spectra 1964 C610 complementer brings fast, clean, quiet compression and limiting to your recordings and mixes. The C610 includes the famous Spectra 101 amplifier used in legendary studios like Stax, Ardent, and Record Plant. I love my C610s for drums, vocals, guitars, and especially bass, which helps me get the perfect low end in my mixes. And you can make your mixes rock at Spectra1964.com. When your band hits the studio, it's smart to have all the songs, mixes, and notes in one place. But figuring out how to share all the files can be frustrating. There's always somebody in the band who can't seem to log in or wants to use a different platform. Samply.app makes it easy to collaborate and communicate by creating a shared project so the whole band can get organized before the session. Just upload a voice memo, lyric sheet, song charts, photo, video, mixes, masters, or even invoices and start commenting. Sign up for your free account now with 25 gigs of storage and unlimited projects, and use the coupon code RSR20 to get 20% off the first 3 months when you're ready to upgrade at samply.app. Well, I feel like I noticed you would do things like you'd say, all right, we're starting with this kick drum here. Now we're going to shape it on the one hand so that it actually one important aspect was making sure that you sculpt it just right so that it actually triggers the sample very well and accurately. So that was an important part. And then sometimes you would shape it and then it seemed like you bring it back in and it's like the live kick drum puts back in this kind of mid-range knock to the sound that makes it believable and real, but the trigger gives you that, that consistent high end and a consistent low end, and it really makes it just sound huge. And then, of course, you continue on in the course to like cover, there's like 10 more layers of icing that like all of a sudden when you get to the end, you're like, oh, now I get it,
Right. Yeah, that you said the key thing though, and sometimes a raw track, an individual track like a bass drum or a snare drum might have a lot of extra information contained in the track that will cause false triggering. And, you can, like with something like Slate's Trigger, you can help yourself a little bit with that, but you can also help yourself on even before it gets to trigger or whatever drum sample thing you're using by doing a little EQ sculpting. Like, if there's too much hi-hat bleed that's rhythmical that could set the snare drum trigger off, or if there's too much snare bleed from the bottom snare into the kick drum that's going to cause that. Sometimes if I'm replacing a kick drum or a snare drum entirely, I'll have to go into the waveform, and the little extras that are on the tail end of the waveform, I'll have to just brutally cut off to make sure that it doesn't falsely trigger the sample. So now I know some people, some people use triggers, some people use Drumagog, some people will just drop in their own particular samples physically. There's a few ways to do it.
That can be challenging. I mean, in my experience, I've dropped in samples manually in Pro Tools. I think that's at some point, particularly for our generation, that's a path you took. You just manually placed them on, and you'd zoom in close to where the drum happened and make sure it was there, because it was never exactly on the grid,
Well, a long time ago, I was moderating a panel at a tape-op conference in New Orleans, and John Keane, I don't know if you know John. John's in Athens, Georgia, and he'd worked with REM and the Indigo Girls, and John wrote a Pro Tools book, and I was just a young pup moderating this panel. And John was on the panel, we were talking, and he said something that I didn't even know was in Pro Tools at the time I was using it. And he said, well, you just tab to transient. I went, whoa, what do you do? Tab to what? And he showed me that. Well, he showed all of us on the panel that in the audience. And I was like, oh shit. Well, that's how that I can speed through that process. So then, I would go back and take my samples, whether they be homemade or taken off of other discs that people would pass around. And I would just I'd create a duplicate of the kick drum track, and I would tab to transient and just go tab, copy, just through the whole track. Yeah. And that was one of the ways I used to do it.
That's a good way to do it. I've done that also where I've got a copy of like Battery 4 plugin on a track, and I can drop in a kick sample or a snare sample into that. And then the next stage is, all right, take the kick track and make a MIDI track next to it and paste a MIDI note at every time the drum hits. So the MIDI will trigger that. But that can be tricky to go through there. I mean, it's Rockstars, if you haven't tried manually scrolling through an entire song and and placing something where every drum hit is, then you haven't yet experienced just how long that takes.
You haven't lived or destroyed that part of your life. You will never get that time in your life back, right?
Yeah, I mean, those experiences where you're like, all right, I'm going to go in there and place all the stuff for the kicks and the snares. So you're like, all right, next 2 to 4 hours, next dinner break, I'll get a break from that.
Well, there's a couple ways of doing that. If we're talking about using MIDI, and I'm a big fan of Superior Drummer, I think that is just the bee's knees. I think it's awesome. If we're trying to generate MIDI, I'll come back to Superior Drummer, but there's a plugin out there from my buddy Steve Massey of Massey Plugins, and he makes the thing called Dirt, which I think is drum replacement tool or something. I can't remember.
That was my guess too.
Yeah, something like that. And it's a simple plugin that analyzes the transients of a track, like a kick drum or a snare drum, and it will write a MIDI track so that those MIDI notes can then trigger, whatever tool you're using to do that. That said, Superior Drummer can take in an audio track and do it pretty flawlessly, and you can go in and really clean up the false triggers and change the velocity and really do a lot of customization of it. And then you can drop that into your Pro Tools session or your DAW session and then trigger the drums in Superior Drummer, which, just the stock Superior Drummer sounds are outstanding. But of course, I went crazy and I went and bought, all the packs that they offer for that system. And that's a whole nother ball of wax because those drum sounds are outstanding. Really, really great sounds.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about that. So one of the things that I feel like this first arrived on the scene with, remember BFD, which I think stood for big fucking drums.
I think it did.
Stood for. But they did a clever thing where they were like, okay, instead of a trigger or a sample just being just that one sound, it's like, what if we triggered the sample and it was like all the variety of mics that might be normally in the drum kit for that particular drum? So like the close mic of the kick, the outside mic of the kick, the overheads, the room, there's all these mics that go into miking up a drum set, and that's where the sound of the drums come from. But when you're triggering the sample to hit, it's like, why not have access to all those so you can control them? So talk a little bit about that if you want, because that I think is integral to things like Superior Drummer you're talking about and Trigger. I think you show some of that stuff as well in the course.
Yeah, what's great about Superior Drummer is there's a little mixer that's inside of that program, whether you use the standalone or the plugin. And let's say you're triggering a kick drum and you've got your MIDI note all set up and you're in your mix and you hit your kick drum and you think, well, okay, that's cool, but I wish I had a little more space around that. You could just go to the mixer within the Superior Drummer plugin and you could pull up the room mics that that come along with that sound. Or, you can, there's some bleed settings, like you can get each mic to bleed into one another. there's like a level of customization that will take you down a very deep rabbit hole if you want it to, or it can be as simple as you want. But it's a great way to just kind of go down, like, open one plugin and really kind of tweak either one or two or multiple sounds. But it also gives you the ability to swap out, different size kick drums, 18, 20, 26, whatever, and swap out snare drums. If I'm doing any cymbal addition, which I rarely do, usually I'm taking the overhead cymbal sound. But if in rare cases where I need cymbals where there were none, I'll go to Superior Drummer to get them, because I can choose from different size crashes or chinas or rides or hi-hats or whatever. And it, like I say, the customization level is pretty mind-blowing.
How would you even do that? How would you replace a cymbal that's already there? Would you still set up sort of audio triggering a sample, or does it become a different process at that point?
Yeah, I'm actually, it's kind of it's a passion project that I still have on the back burner, and I kind of pull it out from time to time. When I was in a band many years ago, a gazillion years ago now, called the Sextants, we did some recordings, and we were doing demos for what would be our second record that never came out. And I really love these songs. And the recordings were done on 8-track at the time, and recorded by our friend David Plank. And I had all those tapes. They were done on, unfortunately, and I hate to throw the Fostex name under the bus here, but the Fostex R8 and those 1/4-inch 8-tracks that those guys made back in the day have so many, I think there's a lot of logic controllers in there. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but there's a lot of potentially electronics that can potentially go bad. Terrible machines in the long run. And if you compare and this is like coming off of, details that I got from my tech, Rance Mannion. Rance told me, if you look at the differences between a Fostex machine and a Tascam machine from way back in the day, the Tascams are far simpler machines, and therefore they're easier to fix today, whereas the Fostex machines contain so many little logic chips that you just can't get today. They're harder to get into physically, and they're a huge pain in the ass. So all that to say, I had these tapes recorded on a Fostex machine, and I bought one off of reverb.com, and it was such a great price. And I thought, oh, I'm getting away with a great price here. This is going to work. Well, come to discover, the winding on track 8 was coming undone. And I took it to Rance, and he said, well, everything is great, but track 8 is coming undone, so you're going to need a head replacement. And I was like, oh my God. Man. So a friend of ours had a head that he was willing to donate to the cause. So that saved me some money, but $180 investment turned into I think in the end, I spent like $700 or $800 to get it all up and running. And I transferred all these tracks from my band. And some of the tracks have the drums and some of the other instruments all mixed together, but some of the tracks have just a stereo set of drums. On those tracks, I'm going back, taking the drum sounds as stereo, and I'll do a pass into Superior Drummer, and I'll make MIDI notes for all the kick drums, MIDI notes for all the snare drums, MIDI notes for all the crash cymbals, because the crashes just sound terrible. Some of them were broken, and there's no decay. And I'm meticulously going through and recreating these drum sounds and blending it with the original stereo track. And my first attempt was fantastic.
So now, if you're doing the kicks and the snares, those might be places where it's really helpful to have a tool like DRT that's going to go through and recognize a bunch, or tab to transient. But things like crashes, they may or may, it depends on if you're riding a crash, but they may only happen at certain parts of the song. So it might be easy, like Tom feels, to just go manually place all those things, right? And then there's another aspect to the MIDI thing where you potentially are going to want some of that dynamic information in those MIDI notes as well, right?
Yeah, and Superior will allow you to adjust the velocity. Let's say I'm doing an 8th note pattern on the floor tom. Well, I'm not hitting the floor tom like, all one velocity. I'm hitting it with there's some ups and downs with that. There's some dynamic range to that. So it allows you to kind of draw that in, to carve that in a bit.
Yeah. And another cool thing about, I don't know that, I can't remember if Trigger would do this, but a Superior drummer, for example, the ones that will give you a variety, I think Trigger will actually, they'll give you a variety of sample options. So they might have a few different samples of that tom so that if you're hitting it repeatedly and writing something, it can play back that slight variation. So it sounds more realistic, right?
Yeah. Both Trigger and Superior operate on that principle of, if you're getting samples from Stephen's catalog, if you're getting the Blackbird kit, for example, there's going to be different velocities that are offered based on the incoming signal.
Yeah. So all these things said, it's really cool to hear it all described. And, the engineer in me has also a feeling of like been there and tried that, done that a little bit, where I was like, oh, I tried it, and I pulled some things in. But then when I heard it, I was like, those don't sound like real drums. And so I struggled with that. And I think that's kind of a classic bit of struggle there. But again, one thing that's very cool, and we'll get into this, is you show in your course, you really show how to use these samples, but have an end result that just makes you go, wow, that sounds like a real drum kit. Look, it might be hard to describe in a few words what gives records a legendary sound, but it would be pretty easy to describe in a few letters: API. For more than 50 years, API Audio has created large format consoles for world-class studios. Famous for co-founder Saul Walker's circuit designs and original 2520 op amp, the sound of API consoles is the sound of great music. API now brings that legendary sound to your home studio with The Box, a small format console featuring the famous API circuitry that is the perfect analog addition to your digital studio. The Box gives you 8 recording channels on the left with built-in mic pre's, high-pass filters, direct inputs, customizable 500 module slots, and 16 summing channels on the right. Or you can mix using all 24 channels, including aux, sends, inserts, and silky smooth faders. API now offers a virtual console experience with a personalized online demo of the Box, 16082, or 2448 console. Sign up for your demo now at apiaudio.com. Atom Audio introduces the new A7V monitor for home and pro studios, the next generation of the incredibly popular A7X. The all-new A-series line of monitors delivers the same highly accurate, transparent sound and unique accelerated ribbon tweeter design that has made Atom Audio famous for over a decade, but now includes new innovations, such as the rotatable high-frequency propagation system waveguide, allowing the XART tweeter to disperse sound with controlled consistency, and DSP-based room correction and speaker voicings. Using the A-Control software or SonarWorks and Measurement Mic, you can now integrate advanced filters directly to the DSP onboard the speaker to help compensate for imperfect room acoustics without introducing annoying latency or requiring plugins. This allows you to tune your monitors for your room, your mix position, and your ears anytime you want to meet your ever-evolving studio needs. Get the extended 5-year warranty for monitors that will improve as your studio improves at atomaudio.com. Hey, Rockstars, we're back now for the jam session, aka the second half of the show, aka where the rock happens. Matt, are you ready to jam, dude?
I'm so ready to jam, bro.
All right. So I was just talking about how, the engineer in me could figure out like, oh, I can figure out how to hook this up to make this trigger a sample or a sound. But then the musician in me was like, why does that sound so fake? I don't really like it. So you seem to have figured out how to use these tools, but end up with something that seems exciting and like it fits the song intention and stuff like that. And it doesn't, like your examples in mixing with drum samples left me feeling like, oh, this is the right answer for this song in production, not like it was an alternate or wrong answer. So talk a little bit more about that. Like, what are some ways to make sure that this all adds up right, I guess?
Well, okay, so there's the obvious balance things that come into question, and you're going to do that. You're going to balance your drum kit in your mix, as you would. So that's the first step. Does it sound balanced within the context of the rest of the drums? The other giveaway, I think, is, the same sound. If we have like a big, da 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 on the snare drum, we want to hear the alternation in that. We don't want to hear the same sound. I think it's like a machine gun effect, I think, is what people call out. That's an obvious giveaway. Also, sometimes it's kind of like, if you were to Photoshop an image into another image and the lighting on the image you pasted in there does not match the lighting of the rest of the picture. So there may be kind of a dirgy quality or a darker quality to the tracks that you're mixing. And if you add a super high fidelity, bright snare drum sample in there, well, that's just going to sound wrong. So what I like to do is, I don't know if dumbing down or changing the light to match is, I don't know if that's that. I hope that makes sense. But
yeah, that's great.
Essentially what I'm doing is let's say in the case of a very bright hi-fi snare drum sound, it may sound great on its own, but when you put it in the mix, it's sticking out like a sore thumb. So I'll use things like the Thermionic Culture Vulture, for example, or a Pultec EQ and, rolling off a certain bit of high end. I'm just trying to tonally get that drum sample, which already sounds really good, to just sit in the mix better and make sure that the lighting, once again, back to the Photoshop thing, making sure its lighting matches the lighting of the rest of the track so that it doesn't, that its sound is not drawing attention to itself, so that you hear it and you don't even think that that's a sample. So those are some of the things. Also, sometimes if we have a sample that needs a little space around it, reverb's probably the most obvious thing people would gravitate to, but there's other things that you could do, like the Universal Audio's the Ocean Way plugin, which you could use to add a little bit of space around your sample so that at least it's got a little room sound. If you're not necessarily wanting, a more reverby sound, this will just give you kind of a room tone around the drum.
That's great. I love the lighting analogy. Rock stars are getting sick of hearing me talk about David Lynch and making movies, but I've been thinking about it a lot lately. And, the concept of, lighting a film shot and making it work. He even talked about how lighting can totally transform a space. I mean, you think about looking at an image and a plain old room with the lights turned up bright just looks like a plain old room, but you turn those lights off and you start putting in lighting just so, and all of a sudden it has depth and it has intrigue to it and all that kind of stuff. So it's a good reminder that, like, if we start out with our analog drums, our acoustic drums rather, in this kind of place, and we're adding the samples to it, we're enhancing those drums. We're not trying to like turn them into some other totally alien robot, unless it's a intentional production decision, but then that's a whole nother conversation.
Right. And also the picture and the film analogies, I really like. It gives you a visual to think about. I've heard Sean Everett talk about, the certain looks of certain films, like old, 1970s films. Those, when you see those have a particular grain to them. And sometimes we want to impose that kind of a character on our mix, on our drums, on what we're doing.
Yeah. Well, okay. So let me see. I've got some other sort of specific questions. Maybe we'll mention one thing that I don't think we discussed yet. But for example, when we were talking about carefully making sure that a drum would trigger the sample to play accurately, again, a tool like Trigger 2 by Slate It's remarkable. Like, we didn't have that stuff. We spent many years not having a tool like that. And what we take for granted now with something like that is, I mean, it's a very remarkable tool for getting a sample to play, sound usable, realistic, exciting, all that. But sometimes still, you're trying to get a snare to hit at the right time as a sample, but the loud kick drum that happened or the tom fill that just went across will pop that thing to play a snare sample where it doesn't belong. And Trigger has something called suppression in it. Can you give us like a brief introduction of what that is and why we would care about that?
Yeah, absolutely. A classic example would be snare and hi-hat interaction. So the way Trigger works is you can plop it on, if you've got a mono kick drum track, for example, you can drop Trigger on that track and you can get it to, sample replace on that track, on a mono track. But if you create a stereo aux track in Pro Tools or whatever DAW you've got and put Trigger on there, it opens up the possibilities of a little more customization. Case in point. So let's say we want to trigger a snare drum. Well, so we've got our snare and that's on a mono track, and adjacent to that, we would have a stereo aux track. So what we would do is we would, on the stereo aux track, we place a stereo instance of Trigger. Then on the snare drum, we would take a send, and I usually take a pre-fader send to that stereo aux track. Then you pan it, and I'm going to probably screw this up because I can't remember off the top of my head. You either pan it hard left going into Trigger or you pan it hard right.
I think left gives you that's going to be the sound and right is going to be the thing that you're suppressing.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah. I'm going to go with you on that. So you would pan the snare drum going into the aux channel hard left on the send so that it's going to the left-hand side of the Trigger input. That's going to allow it to pass through and trigger the snare drum sound. Well, let's say that as Lidge is talking about, there's some other sound that's trying to interrupt what we're doing. You can say, well, that hi-hat's setting off the snare drum. So let's take a feed from the hi-hat track and send it to the right side input of Trigger. And when we do that, there's a knob on there called suppression. And you can then say, okay, turn the suppression up a certain percentage, and that will take a look at the incoming signal from the thing you're trying to suppress, and it will prevent it from setting off the trigger. And that could come from anything. It could come from, let's say it's the rack tom sitting above the snare drum or the hi-hat next to the snare drum. Anything that is creeping in there, this is a quick way to do that, but it involves creating a stereo aux track and putting Trigger on that first, and then feeding in, the corresponding things to either the left to let it pass through or the right to suppress it.
That's cool, man. Yeah. And you do a great, demonstration of that. But the, one of the examples I think we might be familiar with is trying to set a gate on a tom. And you're like, I want the toms to open when the tom fill happens. But boy, those loud snare hits and fills just keep popping it open. And, using the suppression technique like you show in the course, it's possible to actually set all that stuff up so that you don't have to worry about all those things. It can just kind of, each drum will create a sample playback where and when you want it. So it's pretty cool. What about hi-hat? You brought up hi-hat, and the hi-hat, I think there are some examples in there where you actually had a hi-hat mic and you use that in the mix. And it's cool because it seems like keeping the live real cymbals in there and the room mics that have the sound of an actual acoustic kit give you the realism or a level of realism about the sound, the ultimate mix or the final mix, where those samples give you that consistency and, each hit has the right, a consistent low end and punch and stuff like that. So it sometimes lacks from the actual close mic on the drum.
Yeah, I think the hi-hat is at least in rock music for the most part. Let's say we're talking about a heavy rock track where there's open hi-hat. That's kind of I don't know, that brings a realism and a feel to the track in a subtle way. it can interrupt a lot of other things. So you manage it as you will. I tend to use de-essing to manage hi-hats a lot. And then some high passing to get rid of the excessive low end rumble that can creep into a hi-hat mic. But having that right blend of the open hi-hat in a rock track with a great snare drum helps to sell that realism. Because when you hear that hi-hat, it's so unpredictable sounding and it's so random that that human quality is there. Whereas if there's a sample of an open hi-hat, that's when we start to notice it. And that's the thing, it's like special effects. If you notice the CGI in a movie, it's like, oh man, those dinosaurs aren't real. Come on.
I don't know if this is like this with you and your kids, but my daughter's always the one. She's like, oh, it's totally CGI this. So it's totally CGI that. Like I don't know why kids seem particularly attuned to that right now, but mine is. My
kids are quick to point out bad special effects in old movies very quickly. Yeah. Oh my God, look at the TIE fighters in Star Wars. That looks kind of fake. You can kind of see, and I'm like, really?
Yeah, like the old Star Wars movies, you could see this little blue bubble around some of the TIE fighters in some of the early prints, I think. And you're like, what is that? It's flying around inside a bubble?
Well, so that's the thing is we want the emotion of the song to come through, and we want that to be what's most important. And yes, we want great sounds, but not at the we don't want to sacrifice the song for, I got to get my right snare drum sample in there. You got to do what you got to do to make it right. And you don't want to draw attention to it. You want to make it seamless so that people go, even including the band, you want them to think, wow, I know what we gave you on the drum tracks. How on earth did you make that sound so good?
Yeah.
Because when they say that, they know. They think, oh, well, he did something miraculous. Or I should say they don't know. They don't know that you use samples.
Yeah, they don't need to know. It's not like the old days where they're looking over your shoulder in the control room going, is he putting samples on my drums right now?
And I tell the story in the course. I had an interaction with a band, and the guitar player and I were buddies. And he had, I recorded the stuff and I mixed it, and I was sending the tracks to the band, one after the other. And, I would talk to my guitar player buddy, and he'd say, hey man, everybody's giving you a thumbs up here. This is sounding fantastic. And everybody's really thrilled. And then I guess they had a rehearsal, and the guitar player, the drummer said, oh yeah, the drum sounds are sounding amazing. I can't believe that's my kit. And my guitar player buddy let the cat out of the bag. He goes, well, he's using samples. And that's when the guy lost his shit.
Oh no.
And then they came back and they wanted, the drummer insisted that I turn the samples off and give them those mixes. And I said, well, I can't just turn them off. I have to remix it around those sounds to make that work. It's not just an on or off thing. And I said, and I'm willing to do that if you're willing to pay for it.
Yeah.
And that's when they said, that's okay. We'll stick with what we've got. It sounds really good.
Nice.
So that's the thing too, we all have different philosophies on how we deal with this. I mentioned Steve Albini, and Steve's got a very holistic way that I greatly respect in how he deals with bands.
Yeah.
And I think that that's great. But once again, I'm not trying to be Albini. So I do what I do to try to get people's songs to a level that I think meets the aesthetic of the band and the intention of the band. And as long as the band's, along for the ride, we're good. But sometimes, drummers, and I'm being a drummer, I could say this, drummers are a quirky bunch of people. We're a little particular about our things in ways that I don't think guitar players are.
You're the hardest working musician in the band.
Well, I don't know about that.
And you may not get the credit for it either,
Well, drummers, that was a clear-cut case of, it was fine until he knew how the sausage was made.
Right.
And then he wanted to be a vegetarian. So So I was like, okay, dude, it's fine. I get it. You don't like it. I'll remix it, but you're going to pay for the time because you were giving me thumbs up and we're like 8 songs into this record. There's no way I'm going to have to, or I'm going to be able to just turn everything off and give it back to you and have it be the same quality.
Yeah, it wouldn't make sense to turn them off and then deliver a shitty sounding mix either.
Yeah, exactly.
OWC now brings you the Mini Stack STX, the world's first Thunderbolt 4 certified storage and hub expander, perfectly sized to stack with the Mac Mini and the ideal storage and connectivity companion for Thunderbolt or USB-equipped computers and devices. With a universal SATA HDD SSD bay and NVMe M.2 PCIe SSD slot, you can expand your Mini's storage capacity to gigantic proportions. 3 Thunderbolt USB-C ports enable you to connect to millions of Thunderbolt, USB, and future USB 4 drives, displays, AV mixers, cameras, and tablets, as well as desktop accessories like a keyboard, card reader, or mouse. I'm using the Mini Stack STX paired with my Mac Mini M1 to house my dedicated audio SSD and sample libraries, and it works great in my studio. Find the new Mini Stack STX and all your storage needs at macsales.com/rockstars. Have you ever wished you could remove the click track bleed from a singer's vocal mic, the sound of shuffling feet from a full choir, or clicking noises from the valves of an otherwise brilliant trumpet solo? These are just some of the incredible things I have been able to clean up, edit, or remove from a recording using the magic of iZotope RX. Great for mixing with a collection of plugins for your DAW to manage plosives, clicks, S's, noise, buzz, reverb, breaths, and even guitar fret squeaks. With a set it and forget it simplicity that lets you focus on your creativity in the studio while you let iZotope handle the audio challenges. You can even adjust your vocal, bass, and drum levels inside of a finished stereo mix using the wizardry of rebalance. RX is truly magical. Try out the subscription option with an extended 30-day free trial at iZotope.com/rockstars or use the coupon code ROCK10 to get 10% off any individual plugin purchase. So with regards to the hi-hat thing, before I move on to the next question, one example that reminds me of is when the Bee Gees did Saturday Night Fever, they came in and recorded a drum loop because the drummer was not actually available for the session at that time or something like that. And so they just sort of played a bar and they're like, well, let's just build the track off this. And it was a loop of the kick and the snare. Maybe there was a hi-hat in there too or something. And then they just overdubbed all the percussion to that. So if you listen to that song, it's the same exact loop of a kick and a snare, but it's the metal and it's the expression of all that upper frequency stuff that makes it also realistic and compelling.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. And as a matter of fact, I believe, I can't remember the names of the songs in that instance. I know that I think, isn't You Should Be Dancing the loop, a loop from another song?
It might be, yeah.
It's like, they have the full track from one of the songs on the record, and then, as you say, the drummer wasn't available, so then they created a loop, the physical tape loop, because that was in the 70s. There was no Pro Tools, so they made a physical tape loop and stole that groove, and then I think either sped it up or slow it down. I wish I could remember which songs were which, but it works in such a powerful way because the consistency in the groove. And as you say, all the things they overdubbed on top of that really aided that track.
I apologize for not always having names at the tip of my tongue, but I did meet the drummer who shared that story with me at my studio, standing in front of the MCI console at one point. So I was just Googling it here to see if I can remember it, but I don't think I can read Wikipedia quite that fast, Rockstar. So sorry about that. We'll circle back.
Well, I think it's actually, they describe it in a Netflix documentary on the Bee Gees, or maybe it's on Netflix, but there's a Bee Gees documentary out there where they talk about this exact thing and kind of demonstrate it.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. I love the whole tape loop thing. I don't think I ever got to build a tape loop. So maybe I'll still get a chance before it's too late. Okay. So the question I wanted to go to was about checking the phase and polarity of our drums. So that's a thing that is before we even get to the samples. It's an important part of mixing an acoustic drum kit recorded on multiple mics. So could you kind of give us a basic breakdown of how we should understand what it means to get the phase and polarity right on the drum kit before we even begin?
Well, in the most simple form, what we're talking about is the timing of a sound reaching two different points at different times and how that can smear the sound. So, let's just say we're talking about the relationship between the close mic snare and an overhead mic. Just let's say we have a mono overhead. So the snare drum is struck. Obviously, the close mic is going to hear that first, and then it's going to take milliseconds to reach the overhead mic. And that overhead mic the polarity could be, or the phase relationship between those two mics could be reversed, so that the peaks and the valleys of that sound they don't quite match up and cancel each other out, but they are a little bit out of time alignment, and the peaks and the valleys of that sound are going to start to cancel one another out. So the first thing to go is the low end of that. So whenever I get tracks from people to mix, that's the first thing I do is I go through and I'll invert. In Pro Tools, you could just highlight a track or go to Audio Suite and hit invert, and it'll rewrite the track. Or you can even just put a simple EQ plug-in on and hit the phase button and experiment. And if you hit it and the sound becomes bigger and more low end appears, then you're going to need to invert the polarity of that. And I know that people are going to have multiple microphones, so you're going to have to go through and check that on all those. But that's kind of a simple thing to do, just to get, before you even start with samples, is just to make sure that everything is working out. The lazy way to do it, of course, is I think it's the Align plugin. What's that plugin called? Auto Align.
Yeah, Auto Align by SoundRadix.
SoundRadix, that's right. So you can say, well, let's designate the snare drum as the determiner of how we want things to be. And so you'll put Auto Align on the snare drum, and you'll say, send this sound to the other mics. And so we'll say back to the snare drum and overhead. So we'll have SoundRadix on, or the Auto Align on the snare drum, Auto Align on the overhead. The snare drum sends on channel 1 within the plugin architecture to the overhead version of that plugin, and you hit a little calculate button and play the track back, and it'll listen, and it'll determine the timing and the phase alignment of that sound, and it'll shift it in time, in real time, as a matter of fact. And it's a great way you could do that across the whole drum kit, and you could determine what's going to be the drum that determines the I don't know what you would say.
Somebody's got to be the master drum.
Right. That's gonna be the drum that determines everything for the phase relationships. So if you do that, then you could actually just commit those tracks or freeze those tracks. Well, commit would be a better way to go, and or copy that to an Audio Suite version and commit that. But if you do that, then you can get all the drums in a happy phase relationship and get the fullest sound you possibly can out of the acoustic kit. And then, if you're still lacking, then you can explore the drum sample thing.
Yeah, that's cool. And then, an even more basic start to that, which is how you started the description. If we went back to the time of tape coming up through consoles, each track has a polarity switch on it. And so I guess you have to decide what you're going to start with, because you don't want to go in circles flipping polarity. You don't want to get lost. You're like, oh, which one was which way? Which one? I don't even know what I'm doing anymore. So maybe, you decide that your overheads are going to be your master, or maybe you decide your kick's going to be your master because you're like, I want that by itself to feel like it's punching out of the speakers at me, and then everything I'm adding to that shouldn't mess it up, right?
Right.
So then just go through each track, do the kick, start with the kick, then go to the overhead. Which way is better on the overhead against the kick? Okay, cool. Now mute the kick maybe and go back to the snare and be like, okay, which way on the snare is better against the overhead now? That kind of thing.
Oh, it's a rabbit hole that hopefully the tracking engineer took care of, right, and everything sounds really great to begin with. But, we live in a time where, drum tracks are not always recorded in great studios and in great situations where they've devoted the time. Sometimes it's like they just threw up the mics and hit go.
I think also sometimes, depending on what you're doing in the mix, it changes some of those phase relationships too. So, especially if you get into like, if you've got a super compressed effects mic close to the kit, and then you got room mics, a mono one, and then stereo ones. It's like there's a lot of things that are all interacting, and knowing about that as you begin to do your mix is a good thing to be aware of. Just making sure you're checking all those, at least arriving at some starting point, right?
Yeah, it's a good thing to check, but it shouldn't take you forever, and you should get it right and move on.
Yeah, do it quick. That's one of your takeaways from your course is like, let's do this quickly. Let's move on. Let's not hang around all day tweaking something, trying to decide if this is better than that. I feel like the hanging around all day tweaking something is the experience I know about and familiar with in the past. And what's nice about what you show in mixing with drum samples is it's like, keep moving forward. It's these incremental things adding up, the game of inches. And when you get to the end, that's where it's like you have the holy shit moment. So some of the things that you started showing in there were, you already mentioned on this, like a de-esser. So that's not something we usually think about as like, oh, I'm mixing drums, I'm busting out this de-esser. We think like, well, isn't a de-esser for vocals? So right. What are some of the unexpected tools like that we might want to be aware of when we're mixing drums?
Well, the de-esser is probably one of those tools that I use on many things, because I find excessive sibilant high end the most offensive thing on the planet to me. And the Weiss de-esser, the simple de-esser, there's a combo unit that they sell, but the simple Weiss de-esser to me is one of the best de-essers out there. And we all have our different opinions, but find the de-esser that works for you. Try it on things like hi-hats and cymbals, so that it still has clarity and detail, but it's not like a bunch of frequencies above 10K that are building up, or certain hi-hats with their focus around the 2 to 4K range that are a little too close to the baby crying frequency for me. And yeah. My kids are teenagers, so I don't want to go back to that when I listen to your hi-hat. So I want to have some, aggression in there and some crunch in a rock track, but at the same time, I want to make it so that people can crank that tune up and it doesn't, feel like a screwdriver going into your ear. I want it to make, give them impact in the heart and make them feel, like throwing their fist in the air, not like putting their hands over their ears.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So it's using the tools like a de-esser, or something like Gullfoss, for example, these kind of tonal shaping things.
Gullfoss is, to me, that's just that's a different animal, and that's kind of that could be a whole nother discussion. But I usually use Gullfoss in situations where I need, I might put that on the stereo bus just to kind of, as in small doses, just to kind of get things a little more refined on the stereo bus.
It's like the teensy-weensy enhancer.
Yeah, just a little bit, because if you overdo it on Gullfoss, it starts to get really grainy. They have a mastering version, but it's very CPU intensive.
Yeah.
But you talked about unexpected tools in the drum mixing thing. Obviously, just in regards to Chad Blake, which we were talking about earlier, SansAmp or some other kind of saturation plugin like the Thermionic Culture Vulture, or of course, God, I'm spacing on it. The sound device or sound toys.
Oh, the Sound Toys Decapitator?
Yeah, the Decapitator from Sound Toys is a great tool to also kind of tame those high-end frequencies, because you could saturate a little bit and you can cut a little bit of high end, and you really start to inject a little more harmonic distortion and meat into a track. And you got to do it in the dose that's appropriate so that you don't sacrifice the detail and clarity that you may or may not want for that track.
Yeah, I think it's one of those funny mixing lessons to learn is like, you're like, I need more excitement out of this. So you add the excitement generator, some kind of distortion, harmonic exciter. And then it's too exciting. It's too bright. It's ripping your head off. And learning to do the combination, the game of inches, where you're adding some excitement, but then you're toning it back down again and you're sculpting it again back to your controlling the lighting idea,
Yeah.
You might need to crank the lighting way up in the actor's face, but then set the f-stop. I forgot which direction you go, but set the aperture so extreme on the camera that it's barely coming through. It's like, those night scenes where you're like, is that really just daylight with everything just looks dark?
Right. Yeah. All those, film and camera analogies I love. It's like, the aperture and the f-stop and all of that I think are very appropriate. So, if you're into video, you'll totally get it.
Yeah. What the hell is tilt EQ? That was something that I saw you talking about.
Oh yeah, the Tonelex tilt EQ. I'll be honest with you, I'm not really clear if it's just exactly how it works. Maybe it's just a very broadband, shelf that you can, or combination shelf and high pass that you can use. But I just find it's a simple tool to quickly get the tonality, the general tonality that I'm looking for.
Like when your stereo just had a tone knob on it.
Right.
Why do I have to pick all these different choices? Can't I just have it be brighter or more high or more low?
And, that's the trick. Sometimes, you need a complex tool that can get very detailed. And sometimes you need a broad stroke tool or, a simple tool to get what you're looking for. Because, we want to do the mix and we want to stay in the spirit of the mix. And we don't want to get bogged down where you're 6 hours in and you've just then got the drum sound together. It shouldn't take that long.
Never been there, never done that before.
Oh, no.
Okay, cool stuff, man. Well, there's a couple other things I want to talk about with you while we got you here too. And drums is fun, but we don't want to spend 6 hours talking about drums either, right?
Oh, we don't?
Well, no, I guess actually we do. Tell us about this wonderful project that's in your discography, Rockstars. Again, you can scroll down and we've got a link to go listen to a bunch of Matt's work. It sounds great. So this is a great way to find out what I'm talking about when I talk about how Matt transforms the drums. It's in the show notes. Just click on that link. But one of the projects was Domes of Energy. That's a fun thing that you got to do not too long ago. And I believe you're playing the drums on that too. So tell us about that project.
Domes of Energy is a combination of myself and a couple friends up in Oregon. And it started because my friend Cliff Truesdell, actually, who does the music for Working Class Audio. Cliff and I have known each other for a long time. As a matter of fact, he was a student of mine when I did a teaching stint at Pyramind in San Francisco. I was teaching an audio basics and an audio advanced class. And Cliff was always one of those students like right in the front row. He and I hit it off because he's just a rock and roll guy through and through. He's a fantastic guitar player. And I love hanging with him. I love talking with him, and I love making music with him. And so he is a very prolific guy. He pretty much writes and records stuff almost on a daily basis. Some stuff's throwaway, some stuff he does under pseudonyms and puts it out on the internet just to try things. But he's a very accomplished recording person and writer, and he exercises those muscles on a daily basis. And sometimes I would like jokingly say, oh, you should try this kind of a track. And he would, within a day I would get an MP3 from him, just a quick rough mix of something he tried based on my suggestion. And he would say, yeah, it turned out okay, but I don't think I'm going to do that again. So one day we were interacting, I think over text, and I said, I've been listening to a lot of Devo, and it would really be fun to do a Devo tribute record, maybe an EP, something short. And he said, oh, our buddy Clint's a big Devo fan too. Let me see what we could put together. And before too long, he and Clint had not even roughed out. They did guitar, bass, vocals, and scratch drum tracks with loops to, I think it was about 6 Devo songs. And they did them in Logic, and they shared it with me on this platform. I think it's called Splice or Splice. I'm spacing it, but it's a platform where they can basically upload the Logic session, and I can log in, download it, and get cracking. Because I've become very well versed in mixing in Logic lately too. So they send me the stuff. I sit on it for probably, I don't know, 2 or 3 months, just dragging my feet, because I'm thinking, okay, I don't have a place, or, I don't have drums set up at home. I'm not really playing drums these days, and my drums are all packed up. I need to figure this out. So I get in touch with my buddy, Michael Rosen, and Michael's done work with like Tesla and Papa Roach and Journey and a lot of different bands. And Michael he's a fantastic engineer, fantastic producer, rock and roll guy all the way, and really fun to hang out with. So he had set up a new studio, and I actually had dumped a bunch of gear into his studio, mics and outboard gear that I had that I wasn't using. And I said, just hold on to this, put it to use. And he said, well, anytime you need the studio, it's yours. Just let me know. So I reached out. I said, hey, I'm doing this project. Can I come over and have you engineer me playing drums? And of course he agreed. So I took the tracks over. And before I did that, I thought, well, okay, I'm not very skilled at music theory. I forgot all of that I learned in high school. So I'm going to just do this in an engineer fashion. So I went in, I converted everything into Pro Tools, put it in there, and I went through and I made marker tracks at all the different sections and named them a particular thing. And then I did printouts of the markers from Pro Tools on sheets of paper, so that that
was your chart.
That was my chart. It wasn't like the Nashville. What's the Nashville chart?
The system? Nashville number system. This was the Matt Boudreau number system. This
was the Boudreau marker system, we'll call it. Yeah. The Pro Tools marker system. So I took those sheets of paper in, put those on a music stand, and I hadn't really heard the songs all the way through, but I made myself a Pro Tools session with a rough mix so that Michael could just pull it up and hit play, add the drum tracks, and go.
That's awesome, man.
So we did that, and we would do, like a pass through, and I would look at my chart and go, okay, chorus is coming up. Okay, here it is. Boom. Okay, this is what I'm going to do. After a couple, run throughs, by about the 3rd or 4th take, we'd have it.
So this was a way that you didn't necessarily have to play a perfect take from top to bottom of the song. You could kind of do it in sections, or am I mishearing that?
No, you're mishearing that. I actually, for the most part, got it in one take after a couple rehearsal takes. But then there might be a tricky section where I would just say, okay, go to, 2 minutes 4, punch in right before the chorus. And I'm going to get that section on the way out, so that our punch-ins were minimal. So when it was all said and done, I, took my drum tracks that Michael recorded, brought them home, and I mixed it and sent mix 1 to Cliff and Clint. And they were like, this is one of the best projects I've ever been involved with. This sounds so good. And yeah, whatever you did on that first mix, do it on the rest of them.
It does really sound awesome, dude. So you just finished an awesome mix and sent it off to the band, but the singer texts you with lyric changes, the drummer emails you wanting a different fill, and the bass player DMs you about a wrong note in the chorus. But which mix version were they talking about anyway? Don't you wish there was an easier way? Samply.app comes to the rescue as your ultimate mix assistant, streaming full resolution audio so your clients can easily listen and send notes from their mobile phone on the road or the computer back at the studio. All mix comments are time-stamped directly onto the correct mix version with no confusion, and you also get A/B listening capability with synchronized playback and level matching for easy mix comparison, all inside Samply. It's file sharing that was built specifically for music, and it all works inside your browser with no downloads required. Sign up now for your free account with 25 gigs of storage and unlimited projects, and use the coupon code RSR20 to get 20% off the first 3 months when you're ready to upgrade at samply.app. 50 years ago, William G. Dilley introduced the world to his revolutionary new dynamics processor, the Model 610 Complementer. A truly unique device, the Model 610 was not only the fastest, cleanest, and quietest of its type, but was also capable of providing completely separate peak limiting and compression functions. Today, Spectra 1964 introduces the Model C610 Complementer, described as the most versatile piece of audio gear you can buy. Great for adding control and power to everything from vocals, guitars, and bass to mixing and even mastering, the C610 gives you the same massive sound that rocked legendary studios like Stax, Ardent, Advision, A&M, and Record Plant. It even has enough gain to function as a mic preamp. I'm using the C610 on every record I make at the Toy Box Studio, and you should too. You'll love it. Go to Spectra1964.com or call 801-797-0642. I'm still just amazed. I've known you for years, and when I bring up drums and stuff, I think you've said to me like, "Oh, I don't do that. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to go do that." And all of a sudden you do this project. I'm like, how the hell did you sit down and play the drums like that? You sound like you've been playing all along.
Well, I don't know. I think it's just, it's simple music. It's in 4/4. It's not like I'm trying to play, Rush or Dream Theater songs. It's just, it's rock and roll, and I can do that. And yes, it was exhausting. And yes, as a gentleman over 50 who hasn't played the drums in a gazillion years, it took a minute to get on the bicycle and make sure I don't fall off. But once I was on, I was just like, yeah, let's do this. And so I feel like, in spite of the fact that it was a remote session and it was put together in a remote manner, I feel like the feeling and the intensity is there, especially on Girl You Want. That's probably my favorite of all the tracks. That's just rock and roll to me.
So very quickly, one of the things that I feel like is, despite needing to, regain your chops on the kit, the amount of knowledge you've probably accumulated on how to put down and record a great sounding drum set and what you would need later in a mix and a production, and the fact that you're covering a pretty damn good song, probably gave you quite an advantage, as far as getting that going. What drums did you decide to take? I mean, this time you didn't show up with your shitty drums and the shitty heads and the wrong cymbals, right?
Well, fortunately, Michael and I are friends with one of the great Bay Area drummers, Michael Urbano. And Michael's been on tracks with, Smash Mouth and Sheryl Crow and a gazillion other artists, Cracker. And so, we have a small community here up in the Bay Area. So Michael left his one of his Rogers drum kits there. And, it was kind of a mishmash of drum kits that we had. So I showed up, I think, with I think I brought some cymbals. I don't even remember if I brought. I don't know if I brought much at all. I kind of showed up like, okay, what do you got for me? And I just sat down and just started playing, and we made it work. I didn't get too fussy about the drums because Michael has a setup to where he's got a drum kit mic'd up at all times. And he does this all the time with millions of people. So I didn't try to, backseat drive him and go, well, I don't know if that's the right kick sound. I just said, okay, here's the tracks. I'm going to sit and play, get us going. Let's make this happen. Just, letting go of that role for a bit.
Hit the cymbals hard or hit the cymbals gently?
Hit the cymbals to balance within the room.
Okay.
I mentioned Michael Urbano. I think one of the things about Urbano is that he is magnificent at hitting the drums hard and hitting the cymbals just the right amount. He's like one of the most balanced drummers I've ever heard. And I've watched him in bands over the years since I've lived in the Bay Area, since I first encountered him probably in the late 80s. And the first time I saw him, I was like, that guy has something special. And I had to analyze what it was and really over the years try to absorb a lot from him, because he's honestly one of the best drummers I know of for just overall feel and touch when it comes to the drum kit. So yeah, I've learned quite a bit from him. So that said, yeah. Awesome. Hit the drums hard. Don't really nail the cymbals too hard.
Yeah. Okay. I feel like that can be a challenge sometimes when a drummer hits the cymbals too hard. It's like, it's hard to take that sound out of the cymbals, It is. You have to let the cymbal breathe. You have to let that tonality come out. And even if you're writing a crash, you have to let it do its thing. Don't beat it into the ground. What do you think that thing is? The Ringo, that kind of cymbal crash?
Oh, I think that's compression. I think that's a slow release on a compressor. Just, it's like boom. And then I think it's a large cymbal that you're hearing the effects of the release and the compressor, what were those EMI bass compressors that, once again, I'm spacing on model numbers because I don't obsess around.
I can picture it, but I don't know the number either. But I can kind of picture it.
Or maybe it's a Fairchild. Hell, I don't know.
Yeah.
One of those two compressors at that time.
All right. Well, so let me pivot to another question here. Girl You Want, Tons of Energy. You just started talking about how proud you were of how that turned out. I agree. It sounds amazing. I love the sense of space in the mix, because you mixed it as well, right? You did
I did mix it.
Yeah. It sounds freaking great, man. There's a wonderful, sort of short echo delay on the chorus background vocals that happens. That's really compelling. And then there's something really cool about the stereo quality of the verse vocals. And I wonder if you want to talk about those things.
Yeah. The verse vocals, if I'm right, I don't have the session up in front of me, but I could pull it up if we need. But I tend to use the Dimension D quite a bit and run that in parallel to the vocals, so that the vocal may, be a mono instrument, we'll say. It's, right up the center, but using the Dimension D in stereo just kind of in parallel just kind of brings this otherworldly, it all-encompassing kind of thing to the vocal. And I would agree, the vocals do have that quality. And I didn't intentionally set out to do that. I started to, you bring up the faders and you're like, ooh, what's that?
Yeah.
Ooh, I'm going to stick with that. That works.
Well, especially for that kind of production, that kind of, when you get into the cool angular kind of music, angular rock, it's like, I think of like Gang of Four too, and artists like that, where it's like, or the Knack, it's like the stuff where the music itself is tight and quick. It makes an opportunity for tight and quick effects on things too. That can be kind of cool, as opposed to the music that needs to be long and sing out, like. Yeah, go ahead. What's your thought there?
Well, my thought there is part of that is Cliff Truesdell's influence. Cliff is the singer and the guitar player in this particular case, and Cliff was in a band called Tiger Touch that I did some recording at Jackpot in Portland with, and then mixed the subsequent record. and it had done some mixing for them on another record that somebody else tracked. And what I learned about that project is when you're working with Cliff, he doesn't like reverb at all. So any kind of spatial effect like that has to be used either without his knowledge or in such a subtle way that he doesn't really notice it. And he liked the use of the delay on the stops in that song where it says just a girl, and you hear that little delay there.
It's beautiful. Go listen to it, Rockstars. Again, it's in the show notes, so definitely go check it out.
So he liked that, but a lot of those tracks are pretty dry. They either depend on room tone to accompany them, but not reverb.
But didn't you get away with adding some reverb to the snare? I can't remember.
That's either room mics or samples of room tone. Yes, so that's I'm sure people are going, wait, you did the drums and they probably sounded good. Why did you use samples? Well, to augment what was already there to really carry it across the finish line. Yeah, the drum sounds were great, but they needed to be one step beyond great.
Well, I think that's the real learning lesson and the takeaways too, is that it's not about fixing anymore. It's about, and that was the problem. I think I was trying to just fix things in the past, and it's about knowing how to use these tools so that additively it creates a whole new thing that is right for the mix, because the mix is a whole new thing, you know?
Well, and also, you know, I am primarily a rock person. I like rock and roll music in general and tend to, you know, get hired to mix stuff in that genre. So I want, even if I'm fixing, I have to walk away with the feeling of, once again, I'm pumping my fist in the air. I'm going, yeah, that hits me in the gut in the right way. So everything I do is geared towards me feeling like that when I hear rock music, to make me want to crank it up and feel that power and you know, be a little kid listening to, you know, an AC/DC song or whatever.
Yeah, totally. Crank it up and not have it tear your head off.
Crank it up and I want to be able to not only just crank it up, but have you hear that and go, oh, let's just turn it up just a little more.
Yeah, totally did. All right. So we are running up on the finish line here, but I want to make sure we talk about another really important thing for you in your studio. You are getting ready to have an Atmos mixing system at your studio. Is that correct? Tell us about that.
That is correct. That is something I've been thinking about for a long time. And, you know, I'm greatly influenced by my friends and my peers. And I think after, you know, I'm friends with Steve Genowick, who worked with Al Schmidt for many years at Capitol, and talking with Steve and in a separate conversation with Andrew Sheps and also my friend Brad Wood, talking to all those guys, you know, seeing, oh, Andrew's getting it. Steve's been involved in it for a couple of years prior to all of us getting it. And when I saw Brad getting it, Brad and I have somewhat similar size rooms. His is probably a little bit deeper than mine. And I was like, okay, Brad's room's not ginormous. My room's not ginormous. I got to talk to Brad and find out how he's doing it. Once I did that, I was like, I'm doing this.
Oh, if Brad can do it, I can do it.
If Brad can do it, I can. No, well, I mean, you know, if you look at Brad's ceiling is the same kind of, you know, sloped ceiling like I have.
Right.
So his room is, like I say, just a little bit bigger. So after talking with Andrew and Brad and then running stuff by Steve, I was, of course, I thought, well, okay, that involves a lot of speakers. I tend to gravitate towards people I have a relationship with for products to explore, you know, what can I get speakers from this company, and can I maybe get a little bit of a break? You know, they're certainly not going to give anything for free. So what can I do? What's the smart move? So I reached out to Maurice at PMC and Ted at PMC. Ted was an introduction from Brad. And I told Maurice, I said, look, I have concerns about my room size. So I sent him a diagram of all the measurements. I made video, sent him a batch of information. And he said, you totally can do this. And here's how we're going to do it. And he suggested they make these flat speakers, somewhat flat, 4 inches deep, about a foot square, called CI30s. And those are the surround part of this. They'll be on the ceiling. It's going to be a 714 system. So you'll have 3 speakers in the front, and those 3 speakers in the front, the left, center, right, are PMC Result 6s. They're like the entry level powered speaker from them. And then the rest of the speakers, the 4 overheads, the 2 sides, and the back speakers are all going to be CI30s. So they, because they're only 4 inches deep, they can get really close to the surface they're attached to and not be sticking out in the room. And I still haven't made a complete decision on the sub. So I'm going to get those speakers. And then some people go the Avid route with their controller, but in this case, I'm going with a Grace M908 surround controller. I'm friends with the Grace brothers.
Nice.
And so I spoke with them and confirmed that would work. Once again, I ran all this by Maurice and Ted at PMC just to get their experience, because they have a ton of experience doing this and installing things.
And your wife.
Yeah, and my wife. And, after the kids got over the sticker shock of what I was going to spend, my wife was like, well, he's spending that money because he's going to make that money back on the projects he does.
There you go.
So, yeah, I got, the speaker controller, those speakers. And by the time this airs, I will have had it all installed and be running with it. So yeah, it's an exciting new world, and I'm getting into it, and very, very much looking forward to mixing in Atmos.
Do you want to record killer drums in your home studio? Rockstars of Drums will show you how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with examples from a Nashville session drummer in a Grammy-winning studio. Do you want to know how to master your own music at home? Rockstars of Mastering will show you how with plugins in your DAW so that your music will sound awesome when you finish your mixes. And if you're looking for a step-by-step solution for a pro-sounding mix that won't take years to learn, the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass with Craig Alvin will show you a proven method for creating Grammy-winning quality mixes that you can apply in your home studio right now. Or if you just need to learn the fundamentals of creating a great sounding mix, then register for my free course Mixmaster Bundle to get great mixes using simple free plugins. And get started now making your best record ever at recordingstudiorockstars.com/academy. Use the code ROCKSTAR at checkout to get 10% off any course for a limited time. Tell us a little bit, since we're on the drum topic today, what are some things that you feel like you're already aware of that you're going to be addressing as far as how drums are mixed in an Atmos setup?
Oh, gosh. Well, that may be premature, because I think that it's going to be so new. I've been experimenting with it on headphones, because you can do it. You can mix in a binaural fashion with the Dolby renderer.
That includes you too, Rockstars, right? And also you mentioned Logic. I think Logic has that Atmos headphone mixing capability as well built in, right?
Well, yeah, the newest version of Logic has all not all, but it kind of blends the renderer and the Logic software together. It's actually really brilliant how they've done it, because you get Dolby and Apple together, and you can make some things happen. So if you're a Logic user, right out of the gate, it's super easy. If you're a Pro Tools user, it's going to take a little configuration between the Dolby renderer software and Pro Tools, and having those two pieces of software connect.
Do you remember if we can do that for starting? Oh, maybe you're doing it now, but can you do all that between the two pieces of software on one computer to just get started in headphones? I know a lot of people do a dedicated computer and all that.
Yeah. Like, if you go to Capitol, they've got a dedicated renderer machine. But that's becoming less common these days, because, Macs are they're just crazy powerful.
Mm-hmm.
So when I talked to Steve about it, Steve is kind of like, the parental figure of Atmos to me. So he's been at it working, for Capitol and Universal Music Group on it for some time. So when I talked to him, he said, well, what kind of computer do you have right now? And I said, well, right now I got a 2017 MacBook Pro. And he goes, oh, I'm running on a machine older than that, and I'm running both pieces of software. There's no reason why you can't do it.
All right, that's encouraging. And that takes me to my other part of the question, which is, as we get excited about making great sounding drums, and you were talking about like your room and the ceiling and, describing it, it sounds like you're describing it in such a way that we might be familiar with about the size and shape of a control room in our own home studios. So, do the rock stars, if they want to start mixing killer drums and are curious about even, your mixing with drum samples course, do they need $1 million studio to be able to get a great mix and get great drum sounds?
Absolutely not. No. I mean, are we just talking about mixing in stereo?
Yeah. Not Atmos yet.
Yeah. Look, I mean, we're at a time in the world of audio where, a laptop and an Apollo and a pair of headphones and a decent set of speakers will get you, pretty far. Obviously, your room has something to do with it. But we are also in a very interesting point in time where some of our peers are mixing in headphones. Andrew Sheps, although he is mixing in Atmos, he's also mixing in headphones a lot. Glenn Schick, mastering engineer, has been mastering in headphones since 2012.
Wow.
So what was once frowned upon or told that you couldn't do, or as I like to say, people would poo-poo the idea. There's some new ways that you can do things. And I although I respect the old way and conventional methods, I'm open to new ways of doing things and new ways of thinking. If the result, and I don't know, people who have heard me interviewed before know I say this a bunch. If the meal tastes good, nobody gives a shit what stove you cooked it on and the pots you used. Just make the meal good. So if you can make a great mix on a pair of IK Multimedia iLoud speakers and a laptop and an Apollo, good for you. That's great.
Nice.
Do the work. Concentrate on making the clients happy. Don't get too caught up in the gear. If you expect to be using speakers in a room, get the appropriate size speakers for the room. Don't go buy ginormous 8 and 10 inch woofer speakers in a room that's too small, because it's not going to work right.
Yeah, it's got to be a match. It's like impedance matching gear. You got to impedance match your speakers in your room. You
do. You got to match the speakers to the room if you're going to mix on speakers, which, most people do.
So let me ask you our closing question, Matt, which you haven't answered in years. So it's safe to ask it again. We're going to take the Wayback Studio machine. You go, and you go back and find young Matt. And you say, listen, dude, I've come back to give you this one bit of advice. Here's the single most important thing you need to know to be a rock star of the studio yourself one day. What advice, I don't know how far you want to go back, but what advice would you like to go back and give yourself?
Boy, it might be a multiple set of answers, because look, this is a business where you can get yourself into debt pretty easily. We're clever enough to get ourselves a credit card. We're also stupid enough to fill that credit card up with too much stuff that we don't really need. Sometimes I think we, I love gear just as much as the next audio professional or audio amateur for that matter. But, those ads and the clever marketing that goes along with it, there's some things out there that you're going to buy that you really don't need. And you'll find out when you end up going to sell it later on. So my advice is buy what you need, buy the best version of that thing that you need, that you think is going to hold its resale value for the day that you decide to get rid of it, but also the thing that's going to last the longest. Don't buy disposable things. Buy things that, you're going to hold on to. I mentioned the Grace stuff. I've got a Grace M905 stereo controller now. And when I decided to go to Atmos, I said, okay, well, I need a controller. Clearly, I'm going to stick with Grace because I not only do I respect that business, that operation, and what those guys are doing, but their gear is phenomenal and it's well built and it lasts. So that's the other thing, that's the thing. Buy the gear that lasts. And then the other part of that too is when it comes back to, I mentioned that, getting into debt, start socking away money. Plan for the rainy day. Don't spend everything that's in your pocket. If I had taken that advice, I probably would have been in a much different situation than I am today.
I feel like the beginning of our recording journey is a little more forgiving on that front than a little later. So maybe at the beginning, it's good to start acquiring some stuff because you don't have anything to record with yet. And you need to have a, microphone and a couple of mics or whatever. But pretty soon you've got enough to get to work. And that's when you maybe don't need to spend every penny you have browsing the internet and seeing what you can spend it on immediately.
Yeah, I think that we have a tendency, I know that I've had this tendency, so I'm going to assume others maybe had the same tendency. It's like, well, there's a certain retail therapy we all want to exercise. We want to buy something. Oh, I need a piece of gear. Well, I can't afford that. So let me buy this piece of junk microphone from the 1960s that looks cool and that in your head you're thinking, oh, it probably sounds like this. Well, when in reality it shows up, you listen to it and you're like, this was not taken care of and it sounds like crap. And I'm going to lose money selling it. So I'm just going to sell it. So we go through these cycles of stuff like that. So I'm a big proponent of putting in off purchases for, a certain amount of time and then really analyzing, do I really want this?
Yeah. I think that's good thinking. When I was younger, I think I could have gotten myself out of a crappy work situation sooner if I'd been saving my money instead of immediately spending it on things that I wasn't even. I've got gear that I bought, like you just described, that never quite really worked, and it's just sat on a shelf forever. And you know me, man. I need to get better at selling the things that I'm not using. So good advice.
Well, and I want to mention too, this Atmos discussion that we've had. When I decided I was going to do it, number one priority was, pay cash. In other words, pay with money you have. Don't empty the bank account. Don't charge anything. So if I need to do that, the best way to get to achieve those three goals is sell the gear that I'm not using. Mm-hmm. So I went through all my inventory and I said, okay, this, and this. I love these pieces of gear, but I'm not using them. They're sitting at my buddy's studio. So I sold Michael Rosen some stuff. I sold some other stuff on Reverb that I wasn't using and accumulated the cash so I could, call the guys at PMC and call the guys at Grace and buy what I needed and get it done without going into debt.
That's good thinking, man. Well, dude, thank you for being on Recording Studio Rockstars with us again. What a pleasure hanging out with you. I mean, I'm always hanging out with you, but it's a pleasure to be hanging out with you on the podcast.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to hang with the rock stars.
Yeah. Tell the rock stars, where would you like them to go to learn more about what you're doing, over at Working Class Audio, your teaching courses, mixing better drums, all of it?
Sure. We talked a lot about the course, so you can go to mixingwithdrumsamples.com. That'll take you to the information page so you can get involved there and check that out. You could go to workingclassaudio.com and check out the podcast. And you could go to mattboudreau.com to read more about what I'm doing. I've got some playlists there of some stuff I've worked on, including the Domes of Energy stuff, Girl You Want, and the stuff from Cordova, Blind Pride, etc. So yeah, check those things out and reach out if you got a project you want to work on or whatever. You got a question, please don't hesitate. I'm out there. I'm available to talk to.
Awesome, dude. And then Rockstars will include those links right in the show notes too. So you can just kind of swipe down with your finger or something and click the link, hopefully, wherever you're listening to this. And if you are listening to this where you can ask questions and comments, feel free to drop something in and we can get back to you that way as well. Dude, good to see you, man. I will see you soon. Thanks.
Great
for listening
to see you, Lidge. Thanks for having me back on. Appreciate it.
All right, man. Cheers. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever now, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free course at mixmasterbundle.com. And if you want more free content from Recording Studio Rockstars, all you have to do is go to rsrockstars.com/email. Again, that's rsrockstars.com/email to enter your name and email, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, podcast updates, and even free gear giveaways for your studio. Just look for the link in the show notes below. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lij Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music. Recording Studio Rockstars would like to give a big thank you to our amazing sponsors who help make this episode possible: API, OWC, Spectra 1964, Samply, Atom Audio, and Isotope. Remember to use these coupon codes for special discounts. At isotope.com/rockstars, use the coupon code ROCK10 for 10% off any plugin purchase, or start your extended 30-day free trial subscription for access to many plugins. At samply.app, sign up for a free account with unlimited projects and use the coupon code RSR20 to get 20% off the first 3 months when you're ready to upgrade to a pro account. At recordingstudiorockstars.com/academy, use the coupon ROCKSTAR for 10% off any course for a limited time. You will find links to all these awesome sponsors in our show notes. These are all things I highly recommend for your studio. They're going to help you make your best record ever. I would also like to thank our fantastic team here at Recording Studio Rockstars, Vlad Weselchenko, Braden Stremming, and John Richardson, for additional podcast and video production. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.